Okay, this is part 13 of Federalist 15. As you know, we've been talking about these ideas throughout the last few videos, the ideas of checks and balances, division of powers, independent judiciary, bicameral legislatures. Okay, I haven't talked much about this. Bicameral means two houses. Unicameral means one house. What does that mean? The state of Pennsylvania, the legislature of state of Pennsylvania was unicameral. In other words, they did not have a House of Representatives and a Senate. All they did was one house legislature. It was unicameral. Whereas when you say bicameral, look at the Congress of the United States. It's a House of Representatives and the Senate. So you got two chambers, two houses. Because of that, you call it bicameral. And during the Revolution, during the Revolutionary War and first few years after independence, they found out that if you have a unicameral legislature, you will have certain problems. That's why most of the states decided to go with bicameral legislatures. And today, the only state that has a unicameral legislature is Nebraska. And they went to a unicameral legislature not too long ago. So I don't want to just focus on that one state right now. But since most states, 49 of the states, have a bicameral legislature, let's just talk for a minute about why bicameral legislature. One of the reasons is when you have a bicameral legislature, let me just say about the Congress of the United States. The reason it's bicameral is because the House of Representatives, its members are elected for 2 years. And whereas the Senate, the members are elected for 6 years. And the founders thought that if you elect a senator for 6 years, they will be thinking a little bit more long-term about what the long-term interests of their states are, or of their, in this case, long-term interest of the country is. Okay, whereas in the House of Representatives, they get elected every 2 years and they might not be thinking long-term. And they realize that this is a good system to go with. This way, you'll have in one house, in the House of Representatives, people's daily feelings reflected, their short-term interest, and with the Senate, their long-term interest. And when you balance these two, okay, remember the word balance? When you balance these two, then you will have a better government. Okay, now I'll continue with Federalist number 15. The chapter starts, government implies the power of making laws. This is, by the way, this is exactly it follows up with the last paragraph that we looked at. So keep that in mind. Government implies the power of making laws. It is essential to the idea of a law that it be attended with a sanction. If the law does not come with a sanction, in other words, you can apply the law to a person, to a group, you can't let the group know that, hey, if you break the law, you will be punished, you will be taken to the court of law, and you will be either fined or put in jail. That's a sanction. In other words, there is a consequence for it. or in other words, a penalty or punishment for disobedience. Exactly what I just said. Sanction is a penalty or punishment for disobedience. If you don't obey the law, you're going to be penalized, you're going to be punished. And then he says, if there be no penalty annexed to disobedience, the resolutions or commands which pretend to be laws will in fact amount to nothing more than advice and recommendation. So a law without sanction, a law without penalty and punishment, a law that the person does not follow because he or she is afraid that he or she is going to be punished if they break the law, then that's just an advice. It's not a law. You're just giving somebody an advice, or you're recommending something to somebody. So he says, that's why it's important to think about this. He continues, this penalty, whatever it may be, can only be inflicted in two ways: by agency of the courts and ministers of justice, or by military force, by coercion of magistracy, or by coercion of arms. So, if you sanction somebody, if you tell them they have broken the law, okay, when he says you can inflict the penalty in two ways, okay, you find the person has broken the law, you can bring him to justice twice. In two ways. You can either bring him to a court and let the court decide in a very legal, democratic, fair process. Or sometimes if the person is not following the rules and not willing to come and be penalized and let a court decide what his or her penalty is, then you'll have to coerce them by arms. In other words, you have to take the military or whatever to get them to do what you want them to do because they've broken the law. So there's two kinds of coercion. In this case, when he says coercion, it doesn't mean the coercion that we use. It doesn't have the same meaning as we use today. He is saying coerce, force them so that they follow the law. This is what he means. Okay, then he continues, the first kind can evidently apply only to man. The last kind must of necessity be employed against body politics or communities or states. So when a small group of men, 2, 3, 5 people or one person breaks the law, you want to bring him to justice, well, you use your police force. Back then they didn't have the word police, they didn't have the concept of police back then. They would use marshals, sheriffs, things like that. Okay? They would bring that person or small group of people to justice. But he says, if this group is a city or bigger than a city, then you have to use your army. When he says against bodies politic, or communities or states, he's talking about things like a city, a county, a state. Has to be an army that will bring him to justice or put them down in case, let's say, they're rebelling. And then he says, it is evident that there is no process of accord by which the observance of the laws can in the last resort be enforced. Sentences may be denounced against them for violations of their duty, but these sentences can only be carried into execution by the sword. In an association where the general authority is confined to the collective bodies of the communities that compose it, every breach of the laws must involve a state of war, and military execution must become the only instrument of civil disobedience. Such a state of things can certainly not deserve the name of government, nor would any prudent man choose to commit his happiness to it. This is a very interesting thing. He says, and this is very important, he says that if we go with the old system, somebody in South Carolina breaks the law, breaks the federal law, and if you can't bring that one person to justice, if we stay with our old constitution, we have to go ask the state to bring that person to justice. And if it's important and the state doesn't help us, doesn't comply, then there is only one way: to go to war with that state. And he says that's crazy, because if you were to do this, you will constantly be in a state of war. Instead of having a peaceful, prosperous union, you will have a union or a confederacy that's constantly in a state of war. That's why he wants the laws to be applied to men, to the citizens of the state, the federal laws. This way, when a person, regardless of whatever state they're in, okay, whether they are in New Hampshire, whether they are in Massachusetts or South Carolina, if that person breaks the federal law, that person is answerable to federal government. The federal government can punish them. Otherwise, the federal government has to go to war every time with one of those states to get to that person. And he says, what kind of a crazy confederacy is this? We'll be constantly in war, and this would not even be called a good government. So that's why he says, we have decided to write this Constitution, and in this Constitution we have decided to say that the federal law applies to individual citizens also. And we don't have to come and beg the state government to bring the individual into compliance, to make the individual follow the law. We can tell the person to follow the law, and if he or she doesn't, we'll punish him.